Love. Some would say it took a backseat when the pandemic forced us apart. As a family-run and proudly Canadian-owned company, Charm Diamond Centers saw the need to bring us together with tales of love and created the Canadian Love Map podcast. Since then, we've shared hundreds of real, uplifting stories that prove love conquers all. So thank you for listening. We couldn't do it without you. And remember, love starts here. What the world needs now is love. More love.
Stars literally aligned.
He's always been the one.
There's someone out there for everyone.
I'm Nancy Regan, your host on the Canadian Love Map. We are on a journey to uncover and share love stories of all kinds.
He's never forgotten to bring me flowers.
We're hoping we're going to give a little good news to this world.
Even in these dark times, the life continues to go on.
It's all about compassion, devotion, adventure, and of course, love.
Everybody needs somebody. Everybody needs love.
This is the Canadian Love Map.
Well, love is the most important thing.
His approach is, we will do the impossible. Nothing is impossible. That's very admirable, and it's got him a long way. It's a rare attitude. There is nothing that he thinks can't be done. It's very exciting to have a family member with such talent.
Today's love story belongs to Gerald and Spencer. Gerald Knowlton of Calgary and his grandson Spencer Purdy of Vancouver share a unique bond that binds them across 3 generations. And that unlikely connection is a train station. You see, Gerald is one of a rare breed of Canadians who actually grew up in a railway station. His father was the station agent in a small town for 42 years, back in the days when the railway was a vital component of life on the prairies. Gerald wanted to honor his father's life and memorialize the importance of rail stations, many of which have disappeared from the Canadian landscape. So he enlisted his talented grandson on the West Coast, an architect and artist. Spencer designed an incredible public art installation that now stands where Gerald lived as a child in the town of Standard, Alberta. We're about to hear the beautiful story of the Vanishing station. This is the Canadian Love Map. I am so delighted to welcome Gerald and Spencer to the Canadian Love Map. And it's so special to have a grandfather and grandson joining us from Calgary and Vancouver, respectively. And Spencer, I want to start off by telling you and the listeners that your grandfather has told me in no uncertain terms that you are to be the star of this show.
Well, I'm ever so humbled. So.
Well, I did say to him, and I say to everyone now, that we are going to have to lay the tracks, so to speak, by going back and in hearing the history from Gerald. So he's going to have to bite the bullet and really take the spotlight for a little while. How do you feel about that, Gerald?
Well, I'll do my best.
This is the most beautiful story of a piece of public art, and it's also a beautiful story of a grandson and grandfather working together on a very emotional and meaningful project. But Gerald, the reason it came about is because of your history, as I say. Can you tell me about where and how you grew up?
Well, I grew up in a railway, CPR railway station in Standard, Alberta, population of about 345. The railway station was an important hub of that whole district.
And what was your father's job?
He was the railway agent. He was responsible for the operation of the station and the movement of the trains in that area.
So, what was it like for you growing up in that railway station and in that community?
Well, it was probably the most exciting place you could find in any small town. Was the railway station where all the action from the outside world took place. There, first of all, there was no television,
Yes.
and you could listen into the dispatcher's phone. The dispatcher controlled all of the rail and trains between Medicine Hat and Calgary, and it was like a party line. And uh, rather than watching television, which we couldn't do anyway, I'd listen to that dispatcher's phone as the dispatcher cleared the tracks for the troop trains wanting to get the soldiers to the ports. It was a small community. Most of the people were of Danish origin. The Danish church was the only church in the community. My first memory is that 3 weeks of the year, the sermon was given in Danish. Then it became two, and then one. Most of the people in the community spoke Danish, but we didn't.
Oh, that's so interesting. I want to say I have been looking through this incredible book that you wrote called The Station Agent's Boy: The Life and Times of Gerald Knowlton. And I know this is a book that you created for your grandchildren. Can you tell me a little bit about why?
My dad wrote a book and gave it out to his children and grandchildren on his 80th birthday, and it was called My First 80 Years.
That's great.
And I wanted to follow that pattern. Our family originated in Canada in 1635 in Nova Scotia, and we have kept a pretty good history of the family since that time. They landed in Advocate Bay, and there are many Knowltons still there in one form or another, dead or alive.
Well, this book is really an extraordinary gift to your family and for also for the generations that will come after because it's so comprehensive. It's got your whole history. It's got pictures. It's got maps from your travels. And this quote really caught my attention. This is you saying, "When I look back at my days in Standard," which is the name of the community you grew up in, "I realize I had the rare opportunity of observing in one understandable community that could be seen and felt from one end to the other, the whole spectrum of life and its consequences." I would love you to say more about that.
Well, uh, there were different nationalities. We all seemed to get along. We all integrated. We all pulled as one community in the same direction. But it was also obvious if someone was in trouble and why they were in trouble. It allowed you to observe that problem as well, and hopefully how the solutions occurred.
to learn from their experience. I'm very curious now to talk about this project that you and Spencer worked on together. So you'll be happy, Gerald, to know that I'm going to pass the baton to Spencer and he gets to be the star of the show for a while.
Good.
Spencer, maybe tell us first a little bit about Champion Park, because I know that that is an important chapter before the project that you and your grandfather worked on together.
It's an important part of my history, and then an important part of my grandpa's history as well. My grandpa realized in the 80s that these train stations that were in these small communities all over Canada were slowly starting to disappear. And there was, as my grandpa just kind of alluded to, there was a large, rich history in those buildings, and a large kind of rich history in those communities that was, not dissimilar to kind of the grain elevators of nowadays that you would be scattered across the prairies, and now are suddenly starting to I'll use the word vanish a bunch here.
Yes.
So he noticed that, and his station that he grew up in Standard was raised in the I believe it was 1960, Grandpa. Is that correct?
About then, yes.
And so that history had been taken away. But what's super interesting about these railway stations in terms of the design of them is they were kind of prototypes that were the same in every community. There was kind of a different sizes of them, based off of the community, but they were built the same, and built quickly. And so my grandpa found one of these train stations that was a replica of the one that he grew up in a small town called Champion, Alberta, and decided to purchase it, and I guess the word would be renovate it and bring it back to life on a property outside of Calgary. And that started a long endeavor of 40 plus years or 30 years of collecting CPR memorabilia, including trains and more buildings, and creating this park, which maintained the history of the CPR. So it was always sort of fascinating as a kid. And I remember going out there, some of my first memories. And then when I was, I think I was about 9 when my family decided to move out there. My parents wanted to try to live in the country for a bit, and so this was a little bit of dipping the feet in the ocean,
Yes.
and seeing if it suited us. But imagine being a 9-year-old, and so I had the opportunity to live in a train station, not a functioning one, but I was probably the perfect age to do that. Imagine sleepovers in a caboose with your friends, and out in the prairies, and it was the perfect time to do that. So that's part of my growing up is 4 or 5 years living in that station. It wasn't his station, but very similar. And so our lives kind of parallel in some ways, in terms of having the opportunity of living within that history.
Wow. So, Spencer, before we get into what you do as an architect and an artist, I'd like to know how you've been inspired. And I'm curious to know what you learned from the example of watching your grandfather through your life. What was your relationship like, and what did you learn from his example?
Well, it's that's a great question, and my grandpa's been a big part of my life, my entire life, and I'm sure as you said, as you look through the book, his grandchildren are a big part of his life.
Amazing.
And it's not sort of the grandpa that you see at Christmas time, once a year. They were or my grandparents were integral in kind of my upbringing. He's done a very good job of keeping a very large family together. And, I have aunts and uncles kind of all over Canada and Switzerland, and, all over the place. And, I know, and the interesting thing is that family is very important to him, and he's maintained that throughout kind of the next generation. And, I have, as I said, they're kind of all over the world, but I could pick up the phone to any of them, and it'd be like they're down the street. I see them, twice a year, even though they may be on the, the other side of the world. Right.
Wow. And that's really because of the example he set of holding the family in tight.
Correct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So tell me about the call you got, or was it a personal conversation face to face when your grandfather asked you about whether you wanted to be involved in this amazing plan he had?
So I can't remember whether it was a call. You know what? Actually, I think it was face to face, and I might even be in the house right now where it happened. I'm at my at my aunt's house in Vancouver, and if you know my grandpa, which you're starting to know a little bit more, he's very determined and has a plan of attack on what he on I guess maybe it's not the right term of what he wants, but what he wants to see happen, right? And so he thinks things through, and he sat me down and said, I've been approached by the community to make a donation to what we'll get into is called Memory Lane in Standard, and I don't know what this looks like, but I know that you are apt at design and architecture, and is this something that you would want to be a part of? And I instantly. I don't actually know if it was instantly, but I thought about it, and it made a lot of sense, and in a lot of checked a lot of boxes for both himself and me, and that's kind of how it all started.
So it was a public art installation he was talking about. Did you know from the start that that's what you were working on, or was that partly something that came through your collaboration?
No, I don't think it a public art piece was necessarily what was in everyone's mind.
Interesting.
And so I guess backtracking a bit is that the this community of Standard had approached my grandpa to make a donation to this park, which was where the park itself is it's where the old railway lines used to be. So the railway lines are now gone, and where the station used to stand. And so the community had gotten together, and correct me if I'm wrong, Grandpa, on the history of this, but purchased that land.
The land was donated by the CPR in 1923 to create a park, but it stood as pure prairie until 2015. I was asked to find a caboose for them to illustrate the history. I found one in Leader, Saskatchewan, and moved it by truck to Standard. And they installed a bit of rail there to accommodate it. And what I said to you, Spencer, was, what is a railroad without a station?
That is true. I do remember that.
Great.
Yeah.
And Spencer's very imaginative mind could come up with a station replica. And he didn't let me down.
But he did go in a different direction than you expected. Is that right, Gerald?
Oh, yes, but I didn't know. we had no intention of building a new station like the old one. I didn't know what was coming. And of course, I got excited when I found out what he had in mind.
We couldn't share the great stories that we do here on the Canadian Love Map podcast without the amazing support of Charm Diamond Centers. They are Canada's largest family-owned jeweler, and they're proud to be putting love on the map. The folks at Charm Diamond Centers are thrilled to be a part of your love story. So visit charmdiamondcenters.com or one of your local stores. Love starts here. Spencer, let's talk about the creative evolution of what came to be the art installation.
Yeah, so kind of going through that history that we just all kind of talked about factors into the design, obviously, and I think in terms of any sort of piece of art or public installation, the concept is really important, and I think that it's not necessarily. My old art teacher used to quote, we're not just painting pretty pictures. It's about doing something that has meaning and hidden, and it's not even hidden, but has meat to it. And so thank you, Grandpa, for reminding me of that quote, because I do remember it now. And what is a railway without a station? And so kind of building on that, and building on the idea of these stations kind of not being there, and then arriving on the landscape in the 1911, being there for 50 years and then disappearing, really sort of struck me as beautiful, in some sense, right? It was something that wasn't there. It arrived and it disappeared, and that's where I kind of stuck to this word of vanish, right? Because it's almost like we've all been to Nova Scotia, where the fog goes in and the land kind of vanishes, and then it reappears, and then it goes away, and it's a little sort of ethereal in some
mystical,
sense.
yeah.
Mystical, and so I was really sort of grasping on that, and how you could show that in an installation, in kind of one solid piece, explain that story and that history within one sculpture. And as Grandpa was kind of alluding to, I didn't want to build a replica station. I didn't want to build Disneyland, and I don't know how familiar you are with rural Alberta, but there's a deep-rooted history and kind of vernacular in Alberta of building very large things in the middle of nowhere. And there's a very large, I think the thing's 50 feet tall, Ukrainian Easter egg in a small community outside of Edmonton called Vegreville. Or Drumheller is known for their dinosaurs, and they have the largest dinosaur in the world. And these are all kind of roadside attractions that you're kind of like, why is it here? But it's kind of amazing.
Yeah.
And so I kind of grew up going to those as a rest stop along the way, and so there is there is a little bit of history of kind of building big in the middle of nowhere, to some extent, and so I didn't really hold back, and and so I wanted the design to be modern, of its era, but I also wanted it to be reflective of, the history, and also I wanted it to stand out, but I didn't want it to, be a sore thumb. And so changes along the way ended up making it into a metal design. And, what I always go back to in design is through the design process, those changes actually make the project better. And I wouldn't want it the original way that I designed it. It always sort of evolves, and those evolutions, to the most part, are beneficial to the project.
It's a little bit like human beings, isn't it? I mean, some of the most difficult things we go through are very hard at the time, but they forge us.
Correct. Yeah.
They help to create our character and so on, as we heard your grandfather say. So
yeah.
Can you describe what you ended up with?
So, in a nutshell, the design itself is 100 feet long, and it's on the railway tracks that was recreated there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a big metal frame out of steel with a series of 100 fins, let's call them, what I refer to them as metal fins that are 18 feet tall and 1 foot wide, but they are laid along this frame almost like a Venetian blind. The thing is instead of like a picket fence where they're all on 90 degrees, I've turned the pickets, or lack of better term, slats, at a 45, and they're made out of very thin metal. And on each side of this thin metal is the original blueprints of this station from 2011, or sorry, from 1911. And as I was kind of alluding to, these stations were prototypes that kind of went all over the place. So I was able to source these original blueprints. And being a kind of architecture nerd, I have a affinity for old blueprints, and
I get it.
and so I found these, and so the thought was, why don't we blow up these blueprints, put them on these fins on either side, the front and back, and when you're walking along and experiencing this frame of a project, at certain angles, you hit those fins and they're so thin that it actually just disappears. And so you see the landscape behind. But as you continue walking, you hit the flat side of the panels, and the image of the station appears. And so it's an experiential sort of project, because you have to kind of walk around, and the project itself is completely static, but the station appears and disappears as you experience it and kind of walk around it.
Even in photographs, I immediately think it must be magic to walk from one perspective where you see the station and walk along and just watch it, as you say, vanish.
Yeah.
I'm sure people's experience is a little magical.
You really kind of have to experience it to see it. One sort of aspect is, and again, it's kind of one of those happy mistakes, or not even mistakes, it's just something that you didn't really anticipate, is because of the length of the project, being 100 feet long. I thought the whole thing would vanish at once, but because of the length of it, you see it half vanished, half
Oh,
in
wow.
reality at the same time,
You're
which
giving me
actually
chills.
which actually makes it better. And so, if it was only 20 feet long, your perspective would fully have this thing vanish. But it starts to vanish, and it comes back, and it goes away, and it comes back, and I think it turned out really well. But to your point, when the concept was designed, and I brought it to Grandpa after a couple months, and I said, this is what I want to, this is what I'm proposing. You asked the question. I don't think that's what he was thinking. But,
I bet it was a surprise. Gerald, what was your reaction?
I had a lot of faith in Spencer. He also had an engineer working with him, and they had done other projects together. And so, with the assurance of the engineer and Spencer that such a piece of art would work, I gave them the go-ahead to present it to the committee. But in answer to your question, I had faith in Spencer and his partner to make it work.
Wonderful. What was the reaction of the community when they saw the plan, Spencer?
Well, so it was going through one layer after another, right? So first initially I showed Grandpa, and then I flew out to Calgary, and we had a meeting with the committee in I think it's called the Seniors Lodge now, Grandpa, right?
Right.
In Standard, and there was 5 or 6 of them there, and I had the big plans, and they had no idea what I was going to unveil.
How cool for you to, as you say, unveil it. Like, whew.
Well, and that's, it's always it is an unveiling, and what was interesting about the way I did it is I explained exactly what you and I just talked about without showing any images, and then kind of unrolled it and kind of waited for the reaction. And I similar to Grandpa's, I don't think that they had fathomed that that was what fit, right?
Yes.
But I think the reaction came later as it makes sense. for the space. And I think that's sometimes the job of an artist and an architect, is to really sort of grab all of that background information, distill it, and throw it all in a blender, and kind of come up with something that hits the target of what you're trying to accomplish, but is a little bit unexpected.
Well, you did that. I would
Yeah.
love to talk now. I mean, there's so much we could talk about, but I'd love to talk about the day that it was unveiled and presented to the world, and what the reaction was.
So, the committee of this town of 350, they had seen it. I went through the municipal processes of getting it approved, and the design. And as my grandpa was alluding to, I worked with a great partner of mine who I've done a number of projects with. His name is Patrick Whalen, and his company is Exabow, which does large scale installations. So think of an Olympic pavilion, or
Right.
something, a big large exhibition inside of an airport, for a large company like Nike or something like
Mhm.
that, right? And so this is kind of was out of his wheelhouse, but he likes interesting things, and so and we work well together. So that's how we ended up partnering. I remember texting my sister, or it was actually our family group chat, and I texted the group the night before the cranes were going to start installing this, and I said to the group chat, "Who's about to create a large scene in a small community?" And I did the little bit of, like, the emoji of the person raising the hand, going, "Yeah, I'm about to create a scene." And
For
the
better
next
or for
morning,
worse, I guess.
for better or worse, like,
Yeah.
it's all, you can't pull back now, right? And at 6 a.m. the next morning, the cranes arrived, and there's always hiccups in terms of installation, and it was pouring rain the day
Oh,
before, and
no.
um, Patrick, I was in Vancouver at the time. I was coming later for the next day, and got on the phone with one of the community members to help with their tractor to pull the crane out. Like, it was almost in some sense like an old fashioned barn raising. Um,
Oh,
uh,
great.
Very, very quick. And so it was 3 or 4 days, and it was up. And there wasn't really sort of a ribbon cutting at that point, but it was a little bit of, it's up there, and let's gauge the reaction. And so over the next couple of months, I heard through the community members, that it was well received, and I guess it was too big to put a giant bow on it and cut it. So that never really happened in that sense. But I was able to return back or I guess it wasn't last summer, it was the summer before, for the town, or the village, which is now a town, 100th anniversary. And so a lot of people, that town of 350 people swelled very, greatly, from all of the people that had kind of grown up there and left and come back. And it was great to see it being used, because a part of the design itself was also, the intent was to just not kind of create a billboard. It was to create a public space for events in the town, similar to the way the station was a public space before.
Oh, wonderful.
And so, is it used as a, bandstand? Is the, grad photo taken of the high school there? That was kind of the intent. And
Wow.
to see it being used, on that day in the middle of August was, it's very kind of rewarding to see that. So, it's not that big grand moment. It's those little ones. And, another one that I would probably describe is, I went back one time with my grandpa and aunt, and it wasn't a big special day at all. It wasn't their anniversary, and we went out there, and there was a group of kids that were playing on the sculpture. And what I actually found super fascinating is that there were a bunch of kids kind of on their scooters going up and down the platform of, that's in front of this project. And the platform is built in a way that is like your traditional platform. And they were rolling up and down on their scooters, and you could hear the thud, 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 thud of every plank that they were going across. And it completely brought me back to my sister and I playing at Champion Park, doing the same thing. It was the same sound, right? So that
Wow.
was 30 years ago. And 80 years ago, my grandpa was making those same sounds in standard, right? And so it's almost like that never changes, right? Like, kids playing on something never really changes, but the station changed. And so
Yes.
I found that kind of a beautiful kind of analogy of how it worked. Right?
I love that idea of echoes through history. And I'm very curious to know from both your perspectives what it was like the first time. I know it was important for you when the community saw it, but what was it like when your grandfather saw it, the moment he saw it? He had heard about it, he had seen iterations on paper probably, but to be there and have him witness it. Gerald, what was it like to see the actual piece up there?
It was amazing, absolutely amazing. Anyone who visits the artwork now is astonished to find such a large structure in such a small community. They're used to maybe finding something of that magnitude in a metropolitan area, but not in a small town. And the local people, like myself, take great pride in showing it to visitors, and it's made an interesting contribution to that part of Alberta.
Well, contribution's a beautiful word because I think that enriches our lives when we make contributions in a meaningful way. And this definitely fits that category. I wonder if it was emotional for you, Gerald, to see it the first time.
Yeah, emotional in a nice way. I was very impressed with the detail that comes through, identifying the waiting room and the express room and the freight shed is all there, and then it disappears.
Did you think at the time what your father would think of it?
He didn't have the privilege of seeing the this this station, but he would have been very proud of the fact that it'll carry on forever there.
And let's talk about the pride you have in your grandson who created it, because I can tell from reading your book that you are so very not only attached but proud of your grandchildren. How did you feel about Spencer's accomplishment and contribution?
Pride is a good word. It's the best word I can think of uh, how I feel about Spencer's work in this piece and other pieces that he is doing. It's very exciting to have a family member with such talent.
I love the fact that your grandfather talked about how proud he was of you. I'd like you to talk about what it was like to work with your grandfather in a professional capacity after having had a personal relationship for so long.
Yeah, my grandpa's values that he had instilled in us were very professional to begin with, and though my grandpa was very involved in our lives growing up, he gave direction with those, and so I don't want to say that it was always business with my grandpa, but there was always a business side of him. But I never worked with him, and to your point, in that capacity. And we were talking about kind of wearing different hats at different points, and I had to kind of take the role of designer and him as a client, to some extent, and also take the role of the architect, and pushing back on things that I felt were really important versus just like any project, right?
Right.
Where you're trying to get something accomplished and done. And it was a great working relationship, and I'm really glad that we ended up doing it, because it made me understand him a little bit more, and understand his world, growing up, first of all in Standard, but then his very successful business world and how he interacted. But I think, the main things that I really kind of took away from that, and, there's a couple examples and of where, his integrity was really key and important, and that was brought through in the business sense. And, it's been fascinating kind of working. I've worked in the real estate world and in the design world. So I do a bunch of things, but, he's been known in the real estate world in Canada. And I've met a lot of people who had dealt with him in the past. And it's been very rewarding once they find out, that he is my grandpa, that they've maintained that his integrity was paramount with the way that he did business in his business. And, that gives me some pride on my end, because there within my industry, that's not necessarily a given.
Gerald, can you tell me what you love and admire most about Spencer?
His approach is, we will do the impossible. Nothing is impossible. That's very admirable, and it's got him a long way. It's a rare attitude. There is nothing that he thinks can't be done.
Well, I think he comes by that honestly. Spencer, what do you love and admire most about your grandfather?
Tenacity. And you know what? Actually, I could probably hold a mirror to what he just said as well. And it goes back to when he originally or when he asked me about, going on this project, is he has direction and he knows what direction he wants to go. And he sees kind of maybe 3 or 4 steps ahead. And I've learned that from him. And, I actually, I value that in understanding that a little bit more, working through a project like this.
Well, I just want to say it not only is such a pleasure to hear about your special relationship, but also about this incredibly special project. And I just want to say a huge thank you to both of you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope people will take a look online at it, because a picture's worth 1,000 words.
Thank you, Gerald, so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks so much for listening to the Canadian Love Map. This podcast is presented and made possible by Charm Diamond Centers. It's hosted by me, Nancy Regan, and is produced and distributed by Podstarter. We love sharing love stories of all kinds, and that could include yours. So do you or someone you know have an uplifting tale to tell? Reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram using @CanadianLoveMap or email producer@podstarter.io. We'll be back next week with another love story to add to the map.